Hi, boy Mike. Sound was really becoming an issue. So we have fixed that with this mic. Yay! So I almost didn't record this video, and that's because I felt like it was covering some things I had said before. And I was just like, would people think that Stella is saying the same things over and over again? But I decided to because one, there's nothing wrong with repeating things that should be remembered. And two, I am bringing some of the things I've said before into a coherent framework that will help people create realistic content strategies. And that's the theme of today, making realistic content strategies, choosing tactics that you can actually execute that will actually bring results for your business. And this is so important because in the previous video, I talked about how it's very important to open your mind up to different types of content and try and explore and everything. But for a rookie content strategist, there lies a trap. You could do a little bit too much, and then you will have this awesome content strategy doc that nobody can execute. And a couple of weeks ago, I saw a content strategist talk about this exact thing. So she said that she had burnt out because she had created a content strategy, but it was really, really hard to execute. She wanted to cover as many channels as possible, do as many things, but her team was limited and the strategy was just too big for them to do really well. So she had to scale back. So this video is basically covering what you need to do to totally avoid that situation. When you're building out your content strategy and you're selecting tactics, right? You need to decide that you are not going to do some things. And definitely you need a concrete reason for choosing not to go with some certain actions. So instead of just going on gut feel, I've identified four things that you can use to vet the choices. The first thing that you need to consider is the business goals. And you must have heard this before in my previous video where I was talking about like how important understanding what the business wants to do is to deciding when you're trying like the way you go when you're building out your strategy. I'm coming back to that once again. Now, when you're a strategist, your job is not just to come and say, oh, okay, my CEO thinks ranking in search or getting on TikTok is what the business needs um to grow. Those are not goals. You need to walk back to the company goals. What's our target for revenue? What's our target for retention? What's our maybe acquisition goal? Things like that, right? And I'm naming the specific metrics because things like this are what content can influence, and they are also basically what almost every company is trying to get to every single year. This might vary by case, but the most important thing, you identify the specific thing, not the action that your boss thinks you need to take, but what the company is trying to accomplish. And yes, those are two different things. Once you identify it, then you need to prioritize the tactics that support it. So let's say the most important thing for the company right now is ensuring that they keep customer churn down to a certain level. Then you need to focus on retention plays, while of course ensuring that you are still working on acquisition and the other important goals that the company might have. But that just that one thing already maybe cuts out some tactics from your list of options, or it reduces the amount of time and budget you spend on them. And I don't want to get into like one of the points prematurely, so let's move on from that. The main reason I love considering this particular factor is that it's so easy to make a business case for your tactics. And anyone who has worked in house or even an agency, you know how hard it is to get leaders to agree to some decisions you're making, or maybe someone is going to challenge you and say, oh, why don't we do this other thing? So when you have your tactics linked back to business goals, it's easy to make a case for them. We are taking X action because it directly supports this thing that is important to the company. It's very hard to argue with that. I'm not saying it's impossible to argue with that. There will always be people who will bring up more points, and that's just work. But it's harder for them to say no, you can't do this when it's connected to a company goal. The next one is our audience. You know that it's not complete video if I do not speak about the audience every single time. Every single time. Yes. So I've mentioned this, and yes, it was in the previous video, but your media, your audience's media consumption habits, or how they prefer to engage with different channels, how they get their information, and all of those things, that is very important in finding the right tactics that you're going to choose. Because believe me, if you go invest time, energy, money, you have like the business case for a tactic, and then nobody wants to engage with it, it's a loss. It's a loss. But then there's the question, how do I even know what people want? Someone actually asked me this, I think last week, and I told him that there are various ways to do it. So if you have an attribution system already set up where people let you know where they heard about you, that could help you understand the channels they go to find information. The other thing you can use to understand what people like is demographic. So how old are these people? What is their job title? Um, where do they do people like that typically congregate? And for example, if you are in B2B, you know that your audience, maybe even if they range from Gen Z to um from Gen Z to like the boomers, right? They all have something like LinkedIn in common. You know, they go to that channel to either find thought leaders or to get information even from brands. So that already influences the decision for a channel, and hence the tactics that you can employ on that channel. So that's another way. And then you can speak to customer facing teams like your sales team or your CS team. Ask them what places that they mentioned when conversations around finding information about your product, or maybe even where to just go generally for info, for things around work and how to do it better. Find out where those come from. Sorry, what comes up usually, rather. You don't always have to bug your CS and sales team because those people are typically busy. You can go into the software where they record calls and listen to those calls. If you work in a smaller team, you might just speak to your founder. One of my mentees, when we're building out her first content strategy, she didn't really understand what people like engaging with. So I told her to ask her founder, and that gave us so many ideas. Then the final thing is to speak to the people themselves, and you can just do this by reaching out to the maybe people with job titles that you're targeting, and ask them if they want to get on a call to just discuss something related to their industry, and then ask them the question. Sometimes you can offer them gift cards or like some reward for their time. Some people are just okay with speaking without any sort of reward or anything. Yeah. Then the next thing to consider is capacity. Now, capacity can either be time or skills. And This is important because you can tick the first boxes for a tactic that's connected to your business goal and something that your audience likes, and then maybe you can execute it. So let's say, for example, one of the tactics that you want to employ is like a building out a yearly report, because for decision makers in the industry, they want to read those type of things. They will definitely download that type of content, give you their emails, basically lead gen. But you don't have the time to do that, because in between writing, maybe running webinars, shooting videos, and writing reports, talking to decision makers, interfacing with other teams for cross functional work, there's no time. Like maybe you and your team are just up to your neck with work. You can't do it. Like you just need to accept that there might not it might not be a possible path to take. Now there are exceptions to this, and I'll get to that in the next point. But most of the times, that's we don't have the time for it. That already disqualifies a tactic. Or maybe you have the time, but there's no skill to do that. So going back to the ebook, sorry, report example, let's say you're looking at it and there's proprietary data you guys can use from your tool, but there's no one to maybe translate that data into interesting or actionable points that your audience can um read through, or maybe there's no one to design a web page for you to share that report on. And this is an actual thing that happened at one of the places that I worked at. We had data, but we could not share, make a report, because the design team was fully booked. Like the web designer, our graphic designer, nobody had time to do any of these things that were necessary for that report to be launched. So we had to give it up. Now, of course, you could outsource, but do you have the money? Which brings us to our next point. So the final thing to consider is budget. If you don't have the money, you're likely to not be able to execute a tactic. And it's super sad, but yes, that's one of the problems that you will come across. So going back once again to the ebook example, let's say your team is busy, you guys don't have, or you don't have the skills in house, right? Then you're like, oh, I want to outsource this. If no one's gonna give you money to do that, it's gonna remain a dream. But maybe you work in like this VC funded company. And by the way, any VC funded company that is looking to hire, I am here. I have ideas for days. I can bring you customers. Sorry, I digress. Going back to it. Let's say you work in a VC funded company that um has more resources than a small bootstrap startup, and you have the budget to execute some of these things. If they tick all the previous three boxes, then you can definitely go for it. So you will find it super easy to execute. But one thing to consider with budgets is that there's usually someone approving said budget. So you might need to make sure that your approver or decision maker is on board, which is basically supporting that first point I made about connecting any tactic to business goals, because it's easier to make a business case that will convince someone to spend on them. So when we bring these four things all together, what do we have? For you to build a realistic content strategy that you can execute, you need to first make sure that they are things you can make a business case for. There are also things that your audience would prefer or engage with, and they are tactics that you have the skill and or time to execute. If you do not, then you have the money to outsource them to agencies or freelancers or temporary team members that will help you execute them. So once you fulfill these four things, it's easier for you to choose the tactics and also decide against tactics that you are going to use for your content um strategy. So from this, we can totally understand why people just default to blogs when they're doing content strategies, because it's hard. And yes, I'm going to talk about blogs in every video I create. But back to my point, it's really hard to consider all of this and then create a coherent content strategy because there are so many factors. But once again, when you make the effort, the results will always be better than people who did not. So it's worth it. It is worth the extra work, the extra thinking, wrangling with yourself and your decision makers. It is very, very, very much worth it. Okay, so that brings us to the end of today's video. I will link to my Substack and the previous video as well so that you can watch it. Thank you so much for staying to the end, and till next time. Oh, and happy holidays. Wait, by the way, I am in Singapore right now, so I'm going to do a vlog, a travel vlog, and it might be strange, but I really want this channel to kind of be like my newsletter where I share things about work, but I also share things about my life. So there'll probably be a segment with me traveling or sharing my interests or doing other things. And I would love if you watch it and share with your friends or people who just like travel vlogs. Also, share